great. I'll share my screen. It's good to see all of you. Here we are. All right. Can everyone see the screen? Give me a thumbs up. All right. So the pairings of decline in labor force attachment among working class men, all working class men, along with rising mortality rates among working class whites, have led many observers to wonder whether these two trends are related and how we might best explain them. So in this study, we're going to advance, I'm not able to advance my screen. Let me just, okay, try that again. All right. Here we go. So today I'm going to advance two hypotheses. First, I'm going to bring new evidence to arguments that the troubles of these men flow in part from increasingly tenuous attachments to three key social institutions: work, family, and religion. So that's hypothesis number one. The second, newer claim is that working class men are not passively reacting to changes in the economy, to family norms, or to religious institutions, but are actively renegotiating their relationships to these institutions by constructing autonomous, generous selves. So for instance, they focus on their ties to their children, even when they have troubled relationships with the children's mothers. And they seek fulfillment, spiritual fulfillment, even though they may disdain organized religion. In reading their life stories, the desire for autonomy seems rooted in their rejection of the monotony and limited autonomy of the jobs their fathers and grandfathers held in the workplace. But alongside that, there seems to be a new ethos of self-expression. The drive toward generativity, which was defined by Erik Erikson as a desire to guide and nurture the next generation, is typically rooted in past trauma, often from the family of origin. Many say that giving back in order to make the world a better place is a key way to redeem their own past, as well as to protect and nurture the next generation. So in sum, what I'm going to show is that these men show both a detachment from institutions and an engagement with more autonomous forms of child rearing, work, and spirituality, often with an emphasis on generativity. So to fully comprehend the lives of these men, we must consider both the unmaking, but also the remaking of their position in society. So I'm going to begin by describing the general pattern of tenuous connections to key social institutions. And I'm going to draw on in-depth life history interviews conducted in 4 metropolitan areas with a racially and ethnically diverse group of 175 men. These are all, quote, working class men, which we define as those with a high school diploma, but no college degree. Along with work, we focus on family and religion because, at least in the US, these institutions have played a vital role in furnishing the working class with economic resources, moral guidance, and opportunities for civic engagement. Ongoing attachments to these 3 key institutions also connect men to social bonds and defined identities that may keep them in the formal labor market and forestall health problems. Precarious attachments to these key institutions, on the other hand, may dilute their power to shepherd and shift men's trajectories, thus placing them at risk. So between 2000 and 2013, we deployed a very heterogeneous set of sampling techniques in white and black working class neighborhoods in 4 cities, Boston, Charleston, South Carolina, Chicago, and Philadelphia. Because many of these men are detached from institutions, we relied on flyers posted in public places. When possible, we sought referrals from grassroots organizations in the communities. And we approached men on commercial streets during daylight hours. Men who participated were also asked to invite up to two other men to the study. On each of these 4 sites, we recruited roughly even numbers of African American and white men. Additionally, we were interested in the families, so all of the men had to have at least one minor child. And in 2 of the sites, they also had to have one non-custodial child for reasons I can get into in Q&A. And for that later reason, given that later constraint in 2 of the sites, the sample is likely more disadvantaged than one you would obtain with a simple random sample of the population. We had long conversations with each respondent, usually talking with them twice, and each interaction lasted between 90 minutes and 3 hours. So let's begin with work. So the book on the left is familiar to all of us who were here when Michelle Lamont was on the faculty. I believe she published this book while she was at Princeton. But the qualitative studies of Lamont, plus those of Paul Willis, who's been a lecturer in our department recently, and also the surveys of my former colleague at Hopkins, Melvin Cohn, of white working class men in prior generations showed that such men claimed their identity from their capacity for hard work at repetitive, demanding tasks, what Michelle Lamont called the disciplined self. So hold that image in your mind for a minute, the disciplined self. Now, in this slide, the disciplined self is sort of over to the right of your screen. And there's this other thing on the left of your screen, the autonomous generative self. And the stick figure is pushing away the disciplined self. What this is meant to portray is that many of our respondents seem to draw little identity from the unskilled and semi-skilled job that they move in and out of. For example, one respondent we call Bernard, of course, all of these are pseudonyms, had earned an HVAC certification 8 years ago, but he had yet to find a single job in that field. So since then, he'd been getting by working as a security guard in a strip mall, quote, just to pay the bills. I'm not into law enforcement. Now, the successful performance of the disciplined self required not only a certain kind of attitude, but a certain kind of job. Manual occupations that provide stable, the opportunity for stable work with good wages. And of course, these kinds of jobs and the family wage and the family authority that they used to provide are now in short supply. So in the area of work, we saw 4 innovations. First of all, we did see some retreatism. Some men were retreating to the informal economy. Others were in and outs, working some of the time. We also saw men who were so nervous about the ability to maintain employment in the formal labor market. They were getting multiple certifications, hedging their bets against labor market failure in any one area in which they trained. More common, however, were side bets. Men may be working a job like Bernard as a security guard, but they were cultivating talents and hobbies in hopes that they could take them commercial someday. And finally, we asked each participant in our study, the job that what jobs they aspired to. And so I'll give you some sense of how autonomy and generativity, these 2 key themes in the talk, are playing out across these 4 ways of engaging with work. Now we start with Rick. He was working at off the books position. Well, Rick, this is actually not true of Rick, but several men in our sample are working off the books jobs, some for extended periods of time, particularly in construction. A few men recalled periods of time when they were in their 20s, that they fit the stereotype of the young person sitting in their mother's basement playing video games. But in the case of Rick, after high school, but before becoming a father, he went on a surfing safari with a friend, traveling across Mexico and California in a VW van for almost 4 years. The 2 of them subsisted on odd jobs and occasional funds sent from distant family members. Quote, we were totally hipped out, patchouli oil, the whole 9 yards, he recalled. So likewise, Kirk, when he was in his early 20s, moved back in with his mom, and he joined a social club of owners of classic Pontiac Grand Prix cars, and told us he spent nearly 2 years just enjoying the time off, hanging with my buddies. The sojourn, of course, ends abruptly when his girlfriend gets pregnant. And Kirk describes how he feels this impending sense of responsibility, and how he quickly abandons his leisure to get a job in an apartment for the would-be family. It is interesting that none of the men in our sample, none of the 107 men, were pursuing leisure full-time when we talked to them, probably because all of them by this time had transitioned into the father role, which was a condition of being in the study. Now, given the tenuous nature of the work available to these men, a good number that we interviewed tried to build expertise and gain the attendance certifications in a number of different occupations, not really betting on one occupation to provide the family wage and the lifetime employment contract that maybe their grandfathers enjoyed, but instead believing they had to hedge their bet. So Demario was an Iraq veteran. He told us that he aspired to have at least 3 options for an income. If one doesn't work out, then I can have the other 2 as a fallback. Accordingly, after leaving the Army, he used his VA benefits to enroll in a diesel mechanics program, and more recently had earned a certification as a barber. And just as we were interviewing him, he had enrolled in a visual production program at a local state college. Now, you might think this is a frivolous strategy, but we found again and again that men who had gotten certifications in specific trades, maybe in particular HVAC, do fail to find employment in that trade. These men come out of these programs saddled with thousands of dollars in student loan debt, and as a fallback, find themselves like Bernard, working as a security guard in retail or in unskilled manual labor. So they're hedging their bets. Now, Gene is an interesting case. He is one of the other men who are in and out of the formal sector, while avidly cultivating side bets. As I said, side bets are entrepreneurial hobbies and informal occupations that men hope to take commercial someday. So these took a wide variety of forms, but several worked as DJs on the weekends, hoping to own their own recording studios. Others designed tattoos while hoping to become tattoo artists or open their own tattoo parlor. Several were authors who hoped to land a commercial publisher, and Gene was one of these. He'd worked in the past as a PEI and told us he had interviewed dozens of other PIs who, like him, had been investigating infidelity. So he took all these interviews, and I didn't ask if he transcribed them, but he took all of these interviews and put them together to compile, quote, a complete profile of the American infidel. Everything that's in that profile is everything you need to do to survive a marriage. Gene insists he will, quote, publish it someday. So through these side bets, men were attempting to renegotiate their attachments to work in ways that provided autonomy and a capacity for creativity and self-expression. This is reflected in the entrepreneurial nature of many of the side bets and an emphasis on the creative and performing arts, which we saw again and again in these narratives. So the desire for autonomy is also evident in the jobs many aspire to have. So now I'm moving to these aspirational jobs. A considerable number dreamed of starting their own businesses, and this is a theme we also saw in prior studies of the working class and earlier generations. For the men we interviewed, these ranged from opening a barbershop to a cannabis farm. A few had already quit steady jobs to try to start a business, most often in catering, though many times these businesses had failed. These interviews, many of them were done in the wake of the Great Recession, or during a time when injury or family illness had sapped the resources of family networks, and these businesses had gone bust. So as men attempted to renegotiate their involvements with work, they not only wanted more autonomy, but they also craved generativity. Blake completed 3 years of college, but was currently training to become a forklift operator. While doing that, he worked part-time as an AAU basketball coach. So for the express purpose of serving as a mentor to neighborhood youth. This desire, he told us, was rooted in his own childhood when a next door neighbor used to, quote, come out and coach the kids in the neighborhood basketball games. He saw something in the guys that I was around, and so he took us all in and pretty much adopted us. And he is the reason all of us enrolled in college. Bernard, he's the security guard I mentioned earlier, also dreamed of starting a company, quote, doing landscaping and snow removal, and then I can employ kids from the neighborhood. Each kid can have a block, you know. A lot of people, they don't even want to give these kids a chance, but I'm giving them something to work with first. Work for your neighborhood. You know what I'm saying? Larry was one of my favorites. He's from Boston, but hails from Barbados. And he noted in our interview how few resources youth in his neighborhood had to learn about Caribbean culture. So for several years, he'd been involved in sewing costumes like these for the Boston Caribbean American Heritage Festival. And when we talked with him, he was seeking out ways to take this hobby and make it into a commercial venture with the goal of providing neighborhood youth with employment opportunities that stoked a sense of cultural pride. Eventually, he dreamed of opening a community center where young people could learn about Caribbean culture while making and selling ethnic handicrafts. So aside from the examples above, which involve working with youth, other trades commonly named include substance abuse counselor and first responders of various kind. So Bear is a great example of this. He told us that he aspired to be a fighter because not so much for the pain, but because it's self-fulfilling, you know, just to save one baby, to run in and save someone else's child from burning to death. But note that these occupations also often relate to saving someone from harm. Our larger analysis of men's life narrative suggests that many are also focusing on rescuing themselves or those they see as younger versions of themselves. So John, for example, had the words "my pain" tattooed across his neck. He told the interviewer, quote, "I don't want my son to experience the pain I went through in childhood of neglect, someone not loving you, not being there." Thus, the desire for generative work may represent a wish to help young people avoid difficulties they perceive themselves to have had experienced while growing up. In some, the act of helping others may be a form of self-healing. So now let's turn to the family. The men we spoke to seldom invest strongly in the role of romantic partner, but at the same time, they enthusiastically embrace their parental roles. Some have been married and divorced, but most had postponed marriage, claiming that their financial situation wasn't adequate, or rarely because they just weren't interested in marriage. This is very in line with trends in marriage rates for the working class as a whole. The proportion of households with children headed by a married couple, for example, declined dramatically among those without a college degree after 1980, possibly due to the hourglass economy that emerged in the mid-1970s, among other factors. So Robert is one of the few fathers in the study that was married, but others, quite a few others, were in marriage-like relationships. They were living together with a partner and had children in common. Now, even those men, those in marriage-like relationships, usually expressed some doubt about the degree of certainty. They'd often say, if we are still together in 5 years, then maybe we'll get married. So they were tenuous about about these relationships. The married men were a little more confident, but some were nonetheless hesitant to recommend marriage to friends. 33-year-old Robert, a married father of 3, told us, "I have known so many people that have lived together for years, have kids together, things were great, they got married. 6 months later, they're divorced." And I think that piece of paper changes the way people act. Yet fatherhood was highly salient source of meaning and identity for nearly all of these men. When we asked him about parenting his 6-year-old, Fred said, "It's definitely great being a father. You know, you have a little person who looks up to you and is trying to emulate some of the stuff that you do. A child is someone you could kind of help shape and form into like a good person." Brian described fatherhood as follows, quote, "To be honest with you, it's taught me pure love. I knew pure love with my ex-wife, but with my daughter, you don't get anything better than that." You know what I mean? In contrast, men who have been separated from their children are often emotionally devastated. So Bill had lived with his twins' mother for 9 years, but since they separated, he's not let them see the twins. Quote, "She wants me completely out of their lives. She has completely slammed the door and made sure I cannot do anything about it. It has destroyed me. It has destroyed me." What should be clear is that the form of fatherhood these men wish to enact is not modeled on what they observed among their fathers and their grandfathers, who often received sharp criticism for, in their view, merely providing. In contrast, this generation places a strong emphasis on nurture and warmth. Brian, for example, was critical of his father because, quote, "he doesn't show emotions." Now, don't get me wrong, he's a phenomenal father when it comes to supporting his family and doing what needs to be done. He's always done that, but as far as showing emotion, giving us a hug, he just doesn't do that stuff. So to sum up, nearly all the men we spoke to said that the father-child role was central, where the parent-partner role was somewhat more peripheral or fraught. As we saw in the domain of work, this renegotiating of the role in the family allows working class men to claim autonomy from the constraints of the partner role while practicing generativity in the parental role. But Bill's case, which we just looked at, is a bit of a cautionary tale because the success of men's attempts to hold all of this together is highly contingent on the cooperation of their children's mothers. Okay, let's turn to a less often discussed topic in this seminar, religion. Now, there were a small number of men in the sample that were members of an established religious tradition, such as Irish Catholic or holiness. But at least among these men, these roles were not very salient. Jeremy is a great case in point. He says, "I treat church like I treat my girlfriends. I'll stick around for a while and then I'll go on to the next one." As recently as 1970s, white working class Americans attended religious services as often as white college graduates did. So really, at least among whites, there were no educational differences in church attendance. However, the attendance of high school educated whites had fallen substantially by 2010. Church going among college educated whites has dropped a little too, but the gap has increased quite dramatically over time. But despite the fact that they were unmoored from these traditional religious structures, the majority spoke to the central importance of faith in their lives. Brian, for example, told us he was, quote, "religious to a certain point. I don't know if it's necessarily God or something else." Yet he also asserted that, quote, "you've got to have faith because why else would you want to be a human being? Why would you want to have kids or take care of your kids? There's lots of whys that require faith." Brian believed that there must be some sort of ultimate meaning because, quote, "some of the things I've been through in life, there's a reason I'm here because I should be dead." Brandon was heavily involved, that's the word he used, in a Baptist church for about 3 years when he was in his early 20s. But then he told us, quote, "I just started hearing a lot of stuff that didn't really sit right with me. So I started researching." Now today, Brandon doesn't identify himself with any organized religion, but he says he believes in spiritual energies. Many of the men we interviewed did grow up in high school, in households that were at least somewhat religious. Most stopped attending services as soon as they were given a choice, generally in late elementary or junior high school. And as I said, only a few still identified strongly with an established religious tradition. But what was interesting is that, as Mark's case exemplifies, even many of those often questioned the basic tenets of these faiths. So Mark said, I'm not going to say I'm a wholehearted believer. He identified as Christian. There's something far-fetched about him dying and coming back to life. Now, if you know anything about Christianity, Christ's death and resurrection is fairly central to the faith. In some cases, mistrust of religious leaders was cited as a reason for abandoning childhood faiths. Some viewed clergy as little more than scam artists, a theme also evident in ethnographies of the white working class in prior generations. Of the Catholic Church in which he was raised, one said, quote, I mean, it's a beautiful religion, but I see some of the stuff that they have done around the world. You know, you've got priests drinking out of gold goblets while in the villages around them, people are starving to death. Some of the mistrust among those we interviewed seemed to stem from the priest abuse scandal. Greg, for example, told us that while he still tried to mold himself to be like Jesus, those are his words, even though he may or may not have existed, also his words. He rejected the childhood faith in which he was raised, quote, when that whole priest thing came out. I became an agnostic. David hinted that his disbelief stemmed from direct abuse. He was an altar boy who sang on the choir all throughout childhood, but said, quote, something happened to me when I was a kid that sent me in a tailspin. So I sort of gave up on all that shit. Yet he also told us he prayed to his dead grandmother twice a day and more if he was really struggling. Now, Bernard had been raised in the holiness tradition and strict religious family. But one day on February 26th, which happened to be his 26th birthday and was also a Sunday, he recalled that he was sitting in church when he heard a voice. And the voice told him, if you can do better than the holiness faith, then do it. So Bernard listened to this voice. First, he turned to Islam, then to Judaism, then to various Christian denominations and sects. Quote, Catholic, Pentecostal, Baptist, the Methodist, the Latter-day Saints, and Jehovah's Witnesses. Bernard believed that Martin Luther King was a prophet, just like Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. And at the time we interviewed him, he was listening to YouTube recordings of a 95-year-old Jehovah's Witness. Donald's beliefs were more spiritual than religious. He followed the Protestant televangelist Joel Osteen, who runs a megachurch in Houston. He also believed that Joel Osteen was more spiritual than religious. Donald was raised a Catholic, but his faith didn't really take hold until he began participating in AA and NA. He told us, that is when I finally sat down and took inventory of the spiritual part and the religious part of my life. Donald recited the Serenity Prayer, quote, about 25 times a day, and had recently received a gift, a ring with the Serenity Prayer engraved inside. He was strongly opposed to organized religion and despised, quote, religious people. But he was nonetheless deeply engaged in his spiritual life, which is grounded in his experience of addiction and pain. He told us, quote, spiritual people have been to hell. Religious people are afraid of hell. People like me who are spiritual have already been to hell and back. You can't scare an addict. You can't scare me with jail. You can't scare me with death. I'm not scared of anything, but it's religious people who are scared of everything. That's why they pray to Jesus, because they are afraid. So these are what we might think of as do-it-yourself religions. They're highly individualized, and they're also subject to frequent renegotiation. John, for example, believed in the basic unity of all religions and studied them for their underlying truths. He researched, quote, all ancient religions, but particularly Christianity. Yet he told us he was convinced that only by studying the most ancient writings of the Sumerians, which he claimed to have the real story of creation, and other civilizations such as the, quote, Mayans, Incas, and Aztecs, could one find hidden truths that had been obscured by technological distractions and authoritarian suppression. John believed that there were actually 12 planets, not 9, and that this has been known by scientists for some time, but, quote, for some reason the government doesn't want you to know this. Greg described earlier, told us he, quote, watched a lot of documentaries about religion, and I read a lot, including daily meditations written by the Dalai Lama, a book of the Tao, and also a book on parenting from the Christian perspective, which he found, quote, very helpful. So Greg's religious eclecticism was reflected in the tattoos he'd gotten over the years, which included a large crucifix, an elven star, which he referred to as a pagan symbol, and the Eye of Horus, which he thought was the Egyptian god of the sun. It's important to note that technically DIY religions are not moral creeds that demand conformity, but quests for knowledge. So Bernard mentioned earlier, said his spiritual seeking was part of a larger, quote, quest to be a know-it-all. He explained that he wanted to become more involved with the religion because, quote, the older I get, the more well-rounded I want to be. I want to be able to walk in any room, any conversation, any topic, and to at least know something about it. But these DIY religions are often so specialized that men struggle to find others with common beliefs. Brian was very interesting, very passionate about his spiritual journey. He was into the ancient astronaut theories, which contend that the Earth has been visited many times by such beings. He was interested in the cargo cults during World War II. But yet he told us, I'm having a hard time finding friends that I'm able to have conversations with about this stuff. So what's different about these newer forms of religion, these DIY religions, is that they're often devoid of the social bonds and lack the communal aspect of faith that for centuries has provided comfort and structure for religious adherence, plus a mechanism for social engagement. So you might be thinking, I've never heard Cathy Edin give a positive talk. Boy, this sounds like at least a glass half full. But I put the warning symbol up there because in our deeper analysis of men's neighborhood narratives, we also found that the autonomous generative self is also a haphazard self. That's my only pyrotechnic trick in this talk. So our multiple conversations with these men suggested that this autonomous generative self is haphazard. Vocational aspirations usually remain nebulous and tentative. They rarely take the form of an explicit strategy. In the meantime, men's career trajectories are often replaced by a string of seemingly random jobs. In the domain of the family, many of these men transition to parenthood more by accident than by design, and often in the context of tenuous romantic relationships. Some, like Demario, described earlier, didn't learn they were fathers until after their children were born. A few, like Brandon, pictured above, said they only found out when their children were several years old. So Brandon's suspicions first formed when he was looking at his ex-girlfriend's Facebook page, and she posted a photograph of her 2-year-old twins. A subsequent email from her sister confirmed he was the father. He demanded a DNA test, but was delighted to learn that he was a dad. Yeah, we have to remember Bill's case about how contingent Brandy's relationship to these 2 little girls might be if he does not have the cooperation of the mother. In the domain of religion, religious community and systematic belief systems seem to have been replaced by a patchwork of religious identity that holds little sway over behavior and is divorced from the social bonds that have for generation held men to a set of behavioral norms. Ed, who prays to, quote, the God of my understanding, told us that when he learned about the God he learned about in Sunday school was, quote, a God with strings telling us how to live. That didn't work for me. Yet, so now I'm going to like vacillate between the half empty and the half full. Yet, although their attempts to renegotiate roles in all through their attempts to renegotiate their roles in all three of these domains, working class men whose fathers and grandfathers' lives were often marked by limited autonomy in the workplace, gender segregated roles within the family, and religious structures that dictated a rigid set of behavioral norms, are showing signs of moving beyond these strictures. Now, without guardrails, many will falter. And as the mortality statistics show, some may not survive. Yet, nonetheless, these men are laying claim to a measure of autonomy and generativity in these spheres, perhaps denied to previous generations of working class men. So for the fathers and grandfathers, the men Michelle Lamont, Paul Willis, and Melvin Cohn studied, work, family, and religion were created the attachments, investments, involvements, and beliefs that guided and gave meaning to human activity in specific social domain, and did so in a pattern way that was broadly shared and successfully reproduced over time. These institutions not only organize social activity within the community into common patterns of behavior, but supplied norms, beliefs, and rituals that legitimated these patterns. If traditional social roles in these domains in this generation are only tenuously embraced, and if the disciplined self is more often the haphazard self, then it is likely that pro-social behaviors will diminish while counterproductive behaviors flourish. Some would believe, some would read the current evidence is exactly in line with these predictions. But let's go to Emil Durkheim for a little bit of hope. So Durkheim, this is what happened here? We just got knocked out. Okay, we're still going to find Emil Durkheim. There he is. So it has been rightly stated that morality is in the throes of an appalling crisis. The remedy for the ill is nevertheless not to seek to revive the traditions and practices that no longer correspond with present day social conditions. Rather, he argued, we need to introduce greater social justice into their relationships by diminishing those external inequalities that are the source of our ills. To ease the current crisis of working class men in labor force attachment, ill health, and mortality, more than a century later, we may need to do the same. So in conclusion, the optimistic reading of these developments we've described is that working class men are now sharing in the autonomy and generativity that used to be largely the province of the middle class. Moreover, they show interest in being involved fathers and in helping others. And this could represent a widening of the boundaries of masculinity in ways that are more consistent, frankly, with the contemporary family and with some contemporary work. The pessimistic reading is that these men are pursuing goals they are unlikely to achieve because of their lack of social integration. And they must find their way without ties to steady work, stable families, and organized religion. Without that social support, their odds of success diminish, and those who fail to achieve these autonomous, generous selves will have little to fall back on and few people to prevent them from sinking into despair. Okay, I'll stop. Thank you.